Hello, movie nerds, and welcome back to Cinematic Sarcastic, podcast that talks all things movies, television. I'm Natalie, and I'm your host. On today's episode, we are going to talk about Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver. You guys, I feel like, well, let's just back up. So for anyone who's been listening to the podcast for any amount of time, you will know that I did a review on Part 1 of Rebel Moon, and that I had said that I was not on the Zack Snyder hate wagon, that I really kind of was interested in seeing where this would go, like what the second part would be. I was more so excited to see like Zack Snyder's cuts of everything, because I felt like in the first film, you could definitely tell, right, that things were cut out and things seemed to be missing. And even though the story itself wasn't the best, I sort of chopped it up to, well, this isn't necessarily his vision. You know, Netflix had required him to have like shorter versions of the movies that they could put up on their platform first. And so I was like, okay, well, we can't judge it. You know, it's like judging Dune Part 1 without having seen the whole thing. And what if, you know, Denis Villeneuve had to cut like an extra hour out of Dune 1? You know, wouldn't that fundamentally change everything? But I knew at that point, at least, that I was interested in the world. Like, I really liked the world that he had built. And I was interested in fairly a few of the characters. Like, I really like a lot of the people that he got involved in this film. I think he has just this immense pool of talent on Rebel Moon, especially because, you know, I really enjoyed Charlie Hunnam. I really love Jaimin Hansu. Like, he really got a lot of good people for this film. And so I was reserving a lot of my judgment until the second half came out, and then still planned to reserve judgment until, you know, his entire collection, like the director's edition of them, came out. And then Part 2, The Scargiver, landed. And I planned to record this episode last night, and I tried. And it was really just 15 minutes of me just like angry rambling because I couldn't get past how just ultimately disappointed I was in how this had wrapped itself up and what Zack Snyder had done here. I think I was having a conversation with like a friend of mine who was like, have you come to see the light now with Rebel Moon? And I was like, yes, I think I have. Because at the end of Rebel Moon, like, well, and not even the end, we'll just say the entirety of Part 2, we start and end in the exact same place that Rebel Moon Part 1 starts and ends. It is no different. We have taken no steps forward. The only change really in between Part 2 and Part 1 is that we now have all of these extra characters, none of which we really learn anything about or know anything about. I think the first hour of Part 2 could be completely cut out of the film, and it wouldn't change like how the movie progressed overall. Like, everything that happens in the first hour of Scargiver is completely useless. Like, it gives you some background to the characters that, you know, Cora's character had picked up in the first film, but it doesn't do it in a very fluid way. Like, you're not learning about these characters over the course of the film and growing connections with them and getting, you know, that sort of backstory as the movie is going along. Like, they're literally all just sitting at a table and they do this like round robin of exposition, telling each other like where they come from and what their past is and why they're fighting against this particular thing. But I hate when writers do that. I think it is incredibly lazy, especially for someone, in my opinion, like in Zack Snyder's position, where he, you know, he's obviously a Hollywood director. Like, at that point, when you have reached sort of that level that pinnacle of being able to direct and write, you should not be using your time to do lazy exposition. Like, especially coming from a director, you should absolutely understand that show don't tell sort of thing that goes along with storytelling. And I do understand some of the time you kind of have to tell, you sort of have to clue your audience in. Yes, we get an exposition dump at the very beginning of the film where it's sort of giving you the backstory of where we left off with movie 1. I think Dune Part 2 is probably the only sort of recent movie that doesn't do that doesn't kind of give you an idea. Books do it a lot. They'll give you like this little exposition dump of story so far. And that kind of thing is sometimes necessary, but that is okay. But when you're getting exposition dumps, when you're having your characters basically stand up and go, here's my life story so that you know who I am, that's not the correct way of doing it. That doesn't build a connection between that character and the audience. So then once we got into the film and what happens is exactly what you think is going to happen, like there's nothing new. It's all very predictable because it is essentially just part 1 over again. And you know that probably some of these people are not going to make it out on the other side because it is very similar to The Magnificent Seven. But when you start to lose these characters, you don't feel anything, or at least I didn't feel anything. You don't feel that loss because you've never gotten to know them. There is a huge difference between hearing someone's story and like building a bond. And I think all that Zack Snyder did in this film was just sort of exposition, dump everything about these characters without necessarily putting any emotion or feeling behind any of that. And it is such a shame that part 2, like I had some expectations of where I was hoping he would go with it. Like I was expecting this really amazing sort of finale, this really great kind of ending to this story that he was telling, so that when you got into those extended cuts, it made a heck of a lot more sense, why certain things were done the way that they were done and, how that unfolds. And maybe in the cut parts, we would have gotten a lot more sort of those connected bits. But then once you sit down and see the second film, like there is no forward movement. It still is left on a cliffhanger. I don't understand the purpose for that. It feels very much like part 2 is a complete wasted film because yes, they've accomplished a goal, but essentially that same goal could have been accomplished in the first film, and it essentially was, he just sort of unwrote the ending of part 1 and made that, the same story of part 2. It was the most disappointing thing to me, and it has taken most of my joy, if not all of my joy, for the first film completely away from me. And now I don't really care about seeing the extended cuts of it. And it's really sort of disappointing to me because like I mentioned at the beginning, like he got these incredible actors, like he got Anthony Hopkins. I was very interested to see what he was going to do with the character of Jimmy, and really not much was done. I was really excited to sort of see where these characters would end up by the end. Even though I had heard through social media and all of that stuff that Zack Snyder already had like a television series deal, like papers signed and all of that stuff. So I assumed that some of these characters potentially were rolling off into the TV series. And if that is the case, why the hell didn't we just have a TV series to start with and slowly introduce these characters over time and slowly build out their stories and really kind of get to know them through events that are happening, through these little battles or whatever the case may be? I feel like it was just stupid of him to introduce us to all of these characters right out of the gate and then essentially do very little with them, like really do nothing with them. It just was such a disappointing kind of finale and conclusion to the whole thing. It's not surprising to me at all. Like I really had kind of thought the critics for this one were just on, that they were just on this vendetta, that they really hated Zack Snyder and they were just going to bomb this franchise for all it was worth, you know? And then seeing the second film and seeing the critics come and rate it even lower, I was like, come on, that's so hateful. Like, that, you can't be serious. And then I watched it and I was like, wow, he really just repeated movie one over again. Like, really, that's all we've done here is just repeated movie one over again. We've just essentially done it in a different setting, and that's it. And now it's just completely left open-ended. I don't feel any satisfaction for having watched the second one. It was a lot slower too. Like, even though there were a lot more battles and stuff, for some reason it was like less compelling. So I wasn't as invested or as interested in the second film as I was with the first one because it was so predictable, essentially because it was just basically movie one over again. So you're like, well, we know what's going to happen. Like, we know how this is going to go. So why do I need to give it my full attention, you know? Incredibly disappointing. I cannot stress that enough. Like, if you didn't like part one, you are absolutely not going to like part two. And if you did like part one, I don't know that part two is really going to do it for you. It was really disappointing to me, and I genuinely didn't hate the first one. Like, I came to part two completely expecting to be able to like pop on and do my review and be like, suck it, haters. And now I have been tremendously humbled, like tremendously humbled in having stood up and defended Rebel Moon so vehemently, you know, to all of my friends and stuff, because he didn't do anything with it. Like, he didn't do with it what could have been done with it. Like, he had so many great characters set up here. That's the most disappointing part to me, is that I think that the characters and like what he was trying to do had so much potential, and the execution was just such a failure all around. So yeah, I mean, those are my thoughts on Rebel Moon Part 2. I would love to know what you guys thought of Scargiver if you have watched it. Subscribe if you want to join the Movie Nerd family, and I hope to see you in the next episode.